There are a lot of ways to analyze music, and just as many ways of breaking it down. Those two things may sound the same, but the former concerns how the analyst chooses to study and understand the music, while the latter is about conveying these things to their target audience. Despite what you may think from watching my analysis videos, my theory knowledge is only intermediate at best, and how I convey things to an audience relies less on musical technique and far more on intuition and interpretation. In simpler terms, my content isn't really about music theory, I just like sharing my interpretations of composition with music theory as a medium. And it's because my analyses are so interpretive that I've never been more nervous to explain a soundtrack than I am for Yuru camps. Now, to be clear, there's nothing overly difficult about transcribing and breaking down Yuru camp's music to an audience. Most of the soundtrack is acoustic and orchestral, something that I find little trouble working with aside from the chord-based string instruments. Where it gets difficult is, simply put, interpreting why a lot of the music is the way that it is. Yuru camp doesn't exactly have a deep story to follow, nor does it feature characters with a lot of depth and growth, which it shouldn't because it isn't the goal of the series. Yuru camp's greatest strength is in its low-stakes, relaxing floofiness, mixing comedy and cuteness with the natural calmness of Japanese camping activities. Simply put, an interpretive musical analysis can only go as far as the depth of the series, and Yuru camp, as beautiful and fun as it is about as deep as a single raindrop. So strap yourselves in, because today's the day I get over my fear of talking about it. Starting off with Yuru camp's main theme, the piece fittingly features many of the elements that composer Tateyama Akiyuki goes on to introduce throughout the rest of the soundtrack, both instrumentally and atmospherically. The piece opens with a campfire being lit, the crackling fire setting the tone as a mandolin and Irish bouzouki come in with a simple fingerstyle pattern. Acoustic guitars and guitar-like instruments are the most common for representing human connections, and being as portable as they are can easily be associated with camp settings. As the piece progresses, we'll see it develop into a full bluegrass ensemble, bluegrass being the prominent style of music featured throughout Yuru camp's soundtrack. One of the first thematic elements of Yuru camp's music can be seen in the patterns that the mandolin and bouzouki are playing. While extremely similar and only offset by an octave, there are slight differences in them to add a bit of rhythmic intrigue. This effect is much like an echo, an offset repetition of the same thing that has been slightly altered by distance and the reflective surface. This echo effect can also be seen and heard as the whistled melodic line comes in, with the call and response patterns essentially being repetitions of themselves with only slight alterations. First we have the rise from E to A, followed by a rise to B, and then finishing the phrase with another rise to A that turns about to descend back down to E. In its melodic simplicity, mixed with the acoustic instruments and swung rhythm, we're immediately put into a calm state of mind, setting the stage for a series we can kick back and relax to without worrying about what's to come. Skipping ahead, some harmonic tension is built as the constant A chords shift into a B7, leading our ears into wanting a resolution to E. This resolution comes a few bars later, however the absence of the A gives it an incomplete sound, one that Tateyama utilizes to drag out this harmonic tension as the rest of the ensemble builds in. Even with this relatively tense transition building into the new section, it never puts us on edge, but rather works as a transition to inform us of the textural shift that is about to occur. This new, more upbeat section isn't necessarily any less calming, however the quarter beat strumming pattern and percussive elements give the piece a more driving pulse, making the ideas introduced earlier more energetic. Think of it like the leisurely stroll around the campsite we were on before hasn't gotten faster or more intense, there's just more going on around us, more stimuli to steal the listener's attention with. As far as the rest of the track is concerned, it simply continues to build in more instruments, a harmonica replacing the whistling as the lead melodic instrument while an alto flute doubles it an octave down, and a handful of percussive instruments as well. And just as calmly as it began, the piece reduces back into the opening pattern, this time played solo on the Irish bouzouki with the double bass harmonica flourishes and a bit of vocals outlining the harmonies before one final major ninth chord to leave the piece simultaneously open and resolved. This track is clearly much calmer than the main theme, reflecting the relaxed and quiet nature of a character like Rin, who finds solace in the act of camping by herself. This calm atmosphere is set up again by way of instrumentation, utilizing a couple of nylon string guitars and a mandolin to open the piece. Rhythmic groupings of 3, in this case our time signature of 3-4, also tend to have a more soothing or hypnotic feeling than their 2 or 4 rhythm counterparts. This combination of instrumentation, meter, and uncomplicated rhythms creates the feeling of relaxation we experience while listening. Also worth noting is the fact that while the energy levels of this piece and the previous one are vastly different, they are both set at the same tempo of 120 BPM, showing that while tempo can affect how a piece feels, Tateyama has proven here that it is not the only way of achieving this effect. Looking more closely at what the instruments are doing, we can see that the mandolin comes in with a pickup on bar 8, repeating the note on the downbeat of bar 9 before going on to repeat a similar pattern over the next few measures. This is the soundtrack's thematic echo at play, though in a much simpler state than it was previously. Sparse and simplistic as it is, this descending echo pattern creates an unexpectedly memorable melody, giving us just enough intrigue with the phrase descending chromatically to bring us back up to the A we started on. This repeats once again, though this time with a slightly altered phrase ending to land us on the tonic C in the melody. As the piece continues along, it becomes ever so slightly more upbeat with the addition of some fiddle drones, tambourine, double bass, and cymbals. By having the guitars and tambourines emphasize beats 2 and 3, the piece begins to feel more march-like, with the mandolin continuing its echo-like playing in homophonic pairs, mainly consisting of sixths and thirds. Sixths are arguably some of the most beautiful intervals, and thirds are the very foundation of filling out musical textures for a richer sound, making the music not just thematically relevant, but as beautiful as the campsites it accompanies. One far less apparent aspect of the arrangement is the presence of a soft synth hum in the background of the piece, quietly supporting the overall key and harmonies in C major. While it isn't the most noticeable part of the ensemble, it does fill in a lot of the empty spaces in the guitars and mandolins parts. It also has a soothing sound, very atmospherically resembling the same type of open sound heard during film sequences of starry skies or underwater environments. What this all culminates into is, ultimately, a calming tune that soothes the listener into a sense of peace and security. There isn't nearly as much going on as in the previous track, and with the mandolin staying as the main melodic instrument throughout the piece, there is a sense of continuity we can easily latch onto. Not only that, given the mandolin's placement at the front of the ensemble and how it never plays more than 2 simultaneous notes, we can easily associate this with whomever the solo camper is. In most cases Din, but not discounting Nadeshiko as well. This solo protagonist effect could have been achieved with something more standard, such as the tin whistle we hear in many of the other tracks, but by using another guitar-type string instrument, the sounds blend together more naturally. And as we'll cover in the next piece, the tin whistle is used across Yuru Camp's soundtrack to create a much less character-centric effect. Here we have the theme for the Lake Motosu campsite, arguably the most iconic and memorable throughout all of Yuru Camp and the one that has the most recurring theme. This is the very first site we're introduced to in episode 1, with Rin doing what she does best. This is also where she first meets Nadeshiko and sets the series in motion, not to mention that they also return here at the end of season 1, during a flashback for Rin at the beginning of season 2, and in the movie when Rin is researching some of her favorite campsites. As I mentioned before, the most iconic element of this campsite's theme is the tin whistle, coming in with a simple rising call and response pattern that rises and falls in, you guessed it, slightly altered echoes. The relatively middling range it begins in is highly reminiscent of loon calls, a bird that, at least to a Canadian like me, conjures up images of lakeside campsites in the wilderness. Whether this is coincidental or not, the sound itself has a sort of hollowness to it, giving the atmosphere of the track a wide openness that Tateyama manages to capture for each of the campsite's themes. Probably one of the most interesting aspects of the campsite themes is the way that they progress, typically being split up into 3 or more sections to highlight different aspects of either the site itself or the antics that the characters get up to while there. As you may have guessed, the main linking aspect of these different sections is typically the melody, in this case the one played by the tin whistle. The first section has us at a middling tempo with a bluegrass arrangement not too dissimilar to the ones we've already heard. Like the previous track, this one also features a continuous synth drone in the background, though it is much louder here to really drive home the spaciousness of the campsite. The second section of the theme reels in the openness by reducing the reverb and giving the music a more driving, upbeat feeling in the guitar rhythms. The tin whistle's melismatic flow from before suddenly becomes sharp and rigid, timed to the comedic atmosphere of the accompanying whistlers. It's easy to understand that, where the first section was atmospheric and used to introduce us to the overall setting of the campsite, this section has more to do with whatever the characters involved decide to do there. Anything from picking up dead sticks and pine cones to showcasing their camping equipment and cooking skills. The final section of the theme doubles down on the atmosphere of the setting once again, slowing the tempo significantly and bringing the synth drone to the forefront. With the addition of a harp to the ensemble, the theme suddenly becomes much more calming and therapeutic, changing the track from a fun daytime exploration into a relaxing evening mood. This is also the first time we hear the tin whistle drift away from the simple echoing motif with a melismatic solo. This solo still features a fairly repetitive pattern and motif, however this is simply used as a sort of transitional melody to build into the climax later on, bringing the ensemble back together as the main motif explodes back into the forefront. For the most part, each campsite theme progresses in this sort of manner, having a single, relatively simple motif that links together 3 or more sections with fairly different moods. Like I mentioned before, this one is arguably the most iconic campsite theme throughout the series, as it is the one we are introduced to right from the very first episode, showing up again as one of Rin's fondest memories in Season 2. All the way to when the girls have become working adults in the movie. Camp has so much more music than I managed to cover here, and the only reason that I didn't really talk about any more is basically just because I didn't know what else to say. As fantastic as the music is, my style of breaking things down really relies a lot more heavily on why and how the music fits the context of the series, something that Yuru Camp doesn't really need a lot of explanation for. I did think about touching on some of the more comedic and expositional tracks, but aside from just talking about the music itself in a vacuum, you really don't get a lot more out of the explanation than you would just from watching the scene in context. At the end of the day, all I can really say is that the music sounds good because it sounds good. But maybe there's something a lot deeper than what I've been able to explore just from my own interpretation, so if you have any thoughts on why the music fits so well with the series, let me know down in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. This has also been one of my more requested video topics over the last year or so, and I do really want to cover the movie's soundtrack as well, since there's actually somewhat of a story, so the music can fit more into a sort of context that you might not read into as much on a surface level. And if that's something you think you'd like to see, make sure to go support me over on Patreon, where you can vote on future video topics as well as get access to all the transcriptions that I do for all of my analytical videos. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.